Hi. So today I'm probably going to talk about something we've been sort of studying. I had some reading to do last night, and it was Plotinus on beauty. And Plotinus was basically a Neoplatonist, I think. He was a follower of Plato. Um, yeah, the specific thing we had to read was called On Beauty, and so I ended up doing the reading, but no one else in the class ended up doing the reading. So basically, we didn't really end up focusing on that, which is kind of annoying because it was like 20 pages, and I sat up for like an hour last night doing it. But I mean, obviously, it's something that I've got to know anyway for the course, so it wasn't completely irrelevant. Um, yeah. So let's talk about beauty. So what is beauty? Um, and I'm gonna say some other background things as well, which is, I guess, point to the significance of the question. So Socrates basically said that we use words in our everyday life and concepts, and we don't necessarily question the meaning behind the concepts. We just use them and we take the words for granted and assume that we know what they mean. But then when it comes to actually defining the concept with language, we're actually unable to do so because we've never thought about them. So by us questioning the concepts, we supposedly get closer to the truth. Um, and so that's, I guess, the philosophical significance behind talking about the language. And then obviously you've got later linguistic philosophers such as Wittgenstein, who said in his later work that you can't actually pin down the definition of words at all, and you can't convey meaning through language because the meaning of language is so ambiguous. But then that's obviously a lot later in philosophy, and perhaps he's right because there is a lot of dispute over the definition of words and concepts. And I think that's very visible throughout philosophical history and even philosophy today. And even the definition of philosophy is also ambiguous, because the definition is perhaps includes the purpose of philosophy. It includes, the actual action of doing philosophy. And I guess it includes a lot of other things as well, like what philosophy encompasses. So, beauty. What is beauty? I had a discussion earlier, a brief discussion with one of my classmates about this word, and I asked him what he thought. And he said beauty is a preference, beauty is subjective. So then I sort of used the Socratic method and I questioned his definition of beauty as being these things. And I said, well, beauty is a preference, but is preference beauty? Okay? Because a lot of things might be a preference, like your taste might be a preference. The things that you like to eat, that might be a preference, but that isn't the same as beauty. Therefore, it's not a sufficient definition to say that beauty is preference. You've got to go a step further. It's like saying, define a square. A square is a shape. Okay, well, that's a very vague definition because a circle is also a shape which is distinct from a square. And a triangle is also a shape which is distinct from a square. So to say that something is a shape, well, yeah, you're kind of right. Beauty may be a preference, but that's not all beauty is, because beauty seems to be further than that. It seems to be more than that. So, and I'm not saying that I know the definition of beauty, but I'm just saying that, it's more complex than that, and I guess we have to reason our way through it in order to be able to figure out exactly what it is. So, beauty, let's explore that a little bit. Beauty as a subjective preference. Right. I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to explore that. I'm going to be able to say that perhaps beauty is subjective in some ways, What we perceive as beautiful is a subjective judgment, a value judgment upon the external world around us. But then, is there an objective aspect to it also? Like, so if we got a large group of people together and say we were judging beauty of a physical object, like say a face, we got two faces, one of them distinctly beautiful, one of them perhaps ugly. And I think the majority of people would be able to point out the fact that one of them was fit the definition of being more beautiful than the other. And the fact that we can distinguish beauty from ugliness suggests that maybe there is some sort of objective underpinning of the two terms. But it's so confusing. I understand, I don't want to say it's so confusing because I feel like that's a cop-out almost. So what would I say beauty is? Beauty is perhaps an appreciation of some sort of aesthetic value. You know, it's looking at something and being in a sense of awe. So I guess in that sense, beauty is a word that we use to define our relationship to an object within the external world. But not just that, it's almost a positive relationship to an object in the external world, because we would very rarely use beauty to describe something as which is negative. Okay, unless we were, I don't know, using some sort of play on words, like a beautiful storm, but then again you may find the storm beautiful, but then that sort of goes back to beauty being subjective. But the fact that beauty is subjective doesn't really get us anywhere. Maybe it's a component of beauty. Okay, so is beauty in the eye of the beholder? And that's essentially what we mean when we say beauty is subjective. Okay, so let's think about Plato and beauty. So Plato believed that there were forms, right? And everything in the material world is imperfect. It's simply a shadow of the actual form. So the form is the unchanging. It's perfect. It's got nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Like the perfect square, for example. Like we may have squares in nature, and those squares may be recognisable as squares, but they're not perfect squares because they're material. So it's the form of the square that gives the square its, I don't know, that makes us define it as a square. So in terms of beauty, is it that there is a form of beauty of which we use to recognise beautiful things in the world? Okay, and if there is a form of beauty, does it exist external to ourselves? Or does it exist just in our minds as an objective form? And I really don't know, because I feel like, you know, my own bias is going to get in the way of what I think about this. So what, do I have an opinion on beauty? I've really never thought about it so deeply. Okay, so I guess because I don't really have an opinion on it, the best thing to do would be to look at philosophers who have talked about beauty, read about them, and critique their ideas. I think that would be a good way forwards, because that's essentially what this is. I need to gain some sort of understanding. And, you know, I don't have all the answers because I'm biased, and no one person has all the answers, so we have to go out into the world and gather up, you know, different people's perspectives who have perhaps thought about this extensively, and then maybe we can get close to the truth. And I think that's what a lot of philosophy is. It's essentially about what Socrates was saying, about not just questioning everything, but also, you know, having discussions with other people and seeing what they think, so that we could, so that they can clarify their own thoughts and we can clarify our own thoughts. And maybe it's pointless thinking about beauty. Maybe that's a thing. Maybe it's just so abstract that it doesn't really matter. Like, perhaps there are other practical things that we ought to be directing our thoughts towards, which would have much more value. You know, like ethics, for example. You know, maybe it's important that we do think about ethics, because thinking about ethics is actually going to improve the world. Okay, but then maybe we could make a case for beauty. People who are depressed don't necessarily always see the beauty in things, because they're unable to do so due to their own phenomenology. So maybe by coming up with some sort of philosophy surrounded by beauty, which is related to an appreciation for things in the external world, perhaps that could lift people out of their depression. And maybe there is a philosophy like that. It's about appreciating the small things. I guess we could call it mindfulness as well. Looking at a beautiful stone or a beautiful sunset and just appreciating it for what it is. And maybe it's impossible for us to actually attach language to that, and I think that is my perspective. So I can't see there being any possible way of actually attaching a definition to beauty. I think maybe the best one I can come up with is the appreciation. It's yeah, and I think appreciation does cover all kinds of beauty, because it covers internal beauty, which we could say a beautiful soul in Platonic terms, and external beauty, because we appreciate both of those things. And is it true that we appreciate other things like kindness and love? Well, maybe those things are also tied into beauty too. Maybe they're one and the same. They're good. It all comes under the form of the good. And it's clear that beauty is good. And it's clear that love is good. Perhaps. Are there any conditions which would make love bad? And perhaps we could say one-way love, but then is that true love? That's a question. And if it's not true love, then it's not necessarily an objection or a refutation to the idea of love being bad. It's a misconception of love, of what you think love is. But then again, is love subjective? And if love is subjective, then your form of love is different to my form of love. Therefore, we can't make any sort of vast generalisation about the nature of love or the nature of beauty, which is interesting. So I feel like I've come a little bit closer to the understanding of beauty by doing this. I feel like I'm going to settle on the idea that it is an appreciation of the external world. I think beauty and good are almost synonymous in some ways, and I think that's probably how Plato used them. Like, our perspective of beauty in the modern world, I think it's been distorted a lot. It's been controlled by the media, because the media has some sort of ideal. And, I'm not saying that ideal is false, because perhaps the ideal is also shaped by what society is what society perceives as beautiful. The reason the media pushes a certain ideal is because that's the sort of thing that gets viewed the most, and what gets viewed the most is obviously the most popular. And that's what most people think. And that seems to be where we determine truth as residing. And I guess we do place truth on the majority, on the side of the majority, because we live in a democracy. The Greeks lived in a democracy. So that does seem to be a good way of determining what is true, or at least a way that culture is determined that we should decide truth. And we do it in the legal system as well, don't we, with the jury? Not always, but sometimes. We would put an emphasis on the majority of people as to determining whether or not someone is guilty. So maybe we should do that with beauty as well. Okay, right. I think that's everything for this video anyway, so I'll probably make another one in a bit, and thank you for watching.